Good morning. This is a little bit of a departure. I'm not doing a technical lecture. This is more of a story about how I shifted from being a person who worked as a programmer to becoming someone who programmed as an avocation, someone who fell in love with it. And Perl was really central to that. So my career arc was kind of odd. Right out of college, I got a job with a bank doing software development in COBOL. I did that for several years before transitioning into teaching computer science at a university. I did that for several years as well. A whole variety of different things. Microsoft's version of C++, C#, some Unix stuff, some security. And that was fun, and on the side I had picked up PHP, so I started doing some LAMP work on the side, just little freelance gigs. And that was fun too, for a while. But by 2011, I was feeling stagnant. And I was also feeling kind of lopsided. I'd looked at my career and realized that I had basically done some really niche stuff. You know, academia is niche. COBOL, go take a look at COBOL job listings and you can tell me if that's niche, if you can find them. And I knew that there were a lot of common practices in software development that I wasn't aware of. There were tools like Git that I had not heard of but not used. And there were skills that I felt I was lacking. So I made another transition from teacher back to programmer. In 2012, I got a job with a software company in Minneapolis. They had this project, this internal project that had started with their install team, who wanted to understand why installs failed. What were the issues customers were facing and what could be done to fix it? And so they built this two-part application to find out. They had a client-side agent, which would sweep up install logs and some config information and ship it back, and a server-side component that would parse that incoming data and put the interesting bits into a database. And the manager had dreams of putting a reporting server on top of that so that people could go to a website and see this data. But the install team got busy. They had higher priority things to do than this project, so they opened a rec and they went to hiring and they found me. And I was really excited about this because this was getting into a software company where I could learn the kinds of things I wanted to learn. It was an interesting project. I liked the people I'd met during the interview process. All of this was great. The only thing that gave me pause in this was that I would also be responsible for doing maintenance on the two existing components, both of which were written in Perl. I had touched Perl a little bit in college, hadn't really stuck with me. Most of what I'd learned was it allowed some really odd things like postfix tests and magic variables that could mean different things in different contexts. I remembered the idiosyncrasies, but I hadn't really done anything much with it since, and it wasn't something I reached for day to day. But I could read it after a fashion, and I was really interested in doing the big shiny PHP stuff, so I figured, no problem. My expectation was that I would get in and start building out that reporting server, and I'd be able to focus on that for a while, and then I would shift over to whatever maintenance work there was in the Perl. That expectation died my second week. My manager came in and said, hey, now you're through all your new hire stuff, you need to go and extend the processing because there's a lot of stuff coming in that's not going into the database, and that's what I want you to build reports on. So before I even got to the fun, shiny stuff that was already in my wheelhouse, I was pivoting to work in Perl. But I figured this is a learning experience and this is something I want to do, broaden my skills. So I checked out the code and started going through it. and started getting this sinking feeling as I looked through this application. Now, my previous experience with applications, I mean, this was a small application, but it was a lot bigger than anything you'd normally do in academia, unless you were working on a huge project. Most of what you saw were sample programs. And the code I'd worked with at the bank, I worked at the COBOL, I mean, that was built to run for decades. It was waterfall from stem to stern and exhaustively documented and everything in lines with the coding standards that were codified, in 3 huge binders of printout. So that's what I was used to, and then I started looking through this program, and this was not like that. It was well designed. It was very well designed. Utility functions were logically organized into packages, and the packages were in a hierarchical structure. They were using an ORM for a lot of the database stuff, and I wasn't familiar with an ORM, but in principle, I understood what it was doing. And the code itself was pretty easy to read until I got to the main method that did all the parse the data and put it into the database logic. That was a 700+ line subroutine of deeply nested conditional logic and sprinkled with dozens of database object calls, which again were very useful and standardized the code a lot, but to my inexperienced eye, they looked like so much clutter. I started digging through. It took a couple days just to untangle some of the variable scope for things I was going to need. And I started to worry that I had gotten in a little too deep. But I made a couple small edits, and they worked. I added a table to the database and built out processing for it, and it worked. And I started to get a little more confident with it. It was a big unknown, but I was starting to find my way. And of course, I ran into issues, and you ask the Google for help, and sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. The big help I got was from my colleagues. And this is when I really started to see Perl as something on its own rather than just another tool that might be in the toolbox. When I went to my colleagues for help, they were very patient. They were very generous with their time. And they provided a lot of context around what I was doing and why one solution worked and another one didn't. And I thought this was really important. My experience when I was teaching was that context was everything. We think we learn by memorizing facts, but we really don't. We take facts and we put them into a story. We make a narrative that tells us how those facts work, and that's how we learn. And that's what I always tried to do when I was teaching, and that's what my colleagues were helping me do. And then one of them pointed me towards Perl monks. And that, oh, well, there was only the one slide anyway. That was remarkable also. Have you ever gone into an online community, forum, whatever, and someone comes in, some poor newbie, with some question that, 6 months in, everybody knows the answer, but this person didn't. They come in and they ask the question, and they immediately get shut down with RTFM. Did you even look at the documentation before you bothered us? Yeah, don't you know how to Google? And that didn't really appeal to me. I never engaged with those, so I hadn't really gone looking for some online resource for Perl until I got pointed to Perl monks. And Perl monks was different. That was a larger community of what I was already experiencing with my colleagues. People who did not just shut you down, even if it was a simple question, were courteous, genuinely tried to help, and if someone said, go read the manual, they usually included a link to the manual. And I began to see Perl in light of this community. It's a little bit like, I realized it was a little bit like walking up to a campfire on a really cold night, just that welcoming sense. I started to get that from the Perl community. But the thing that really encouraged me was that this work to extend this processing node was going very fast. It was going much faster than I would have expected. Far sooner than I anticipated, that work was done. All the necessary items were going into the database, and I could turn around and go back to the fun stuff, the PHP, the website. And that's what I did for the next few months. Just solid PHP, building out the website, building the reports for this database queries, yada, yada, yada. And then, about 5 months in, my manager stopped by again and said, now that that's running, I need you to shift over and start expanding the client-side agent. There's other things that we want to get so that we can understand what issues are happening, and so you need to go and build that. So this was an order of magnitude larger than what I'd done with the processing. This was not just building on something that was already there. This was brand new work. But the client-side agent had been designed from the start to be extensible. It had a plugin framework, so I was just building another plugin for that. And I could take the basic framework structure and have that built very quickly and then start expanding on it. After that, it was more research and asking my colleagues for help. And at that time, I got pointed towards CPAN for something. I don't even remember what. I had encountered some problem, and I'd be able to write the code around it, but it was going to take me at least a week. And one of my colleagues said, hey, go take a look at this module on CPAN. So I pulled it down and tried it in a little test script, and it worked. And I put it into the new code I was building, and it worked. And it's one of those things where you know the value of something like CPAN in the abstract, but until you start using it, you don't really appreciate how much time it saves you or how much confidence it gives you in your own code. Because you're not just relying on this week's worth of code that you hacked together to do something. You're relying on a module that's, in this case, had tests, had been around for a while, and was reliable. I could have more faith in the quality of my code because I could build on the quality of other code. And again, that work went very quickly. And I started to realize something during this process. Well, realize. Has anyone heard that PHP has some issues? So I had heard that, but when I started learning it, and it was all self-taught, PHP was also great because it was really fast to pick up, and I could get stuff done fairly quickly in it, which is not the case in COBOL. I don't know if anyone's even tried to do web stuff in COBOL. Of course, somebody has tried to do it. So I'd known about those things like, yes, it has poor error handling, and yes, there are inconsistent variable names, and yes, 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 yes. But by the time I'd gotten to this company, I was familiar enough with PHP that those were kind of invisible to me. The weeds had grown up. I couldn't see the potholes anymore. But now I had just done several weeks working very solidly in Perl, getting my feet wet with it, and then done this chunk of PHP work, and then shifted again into another solid block of Perl. And I became very aware of how I felt during each of those processes. PHP hurt. It was like trying to ford a river cross a fast-rushing stream and you're trying to go that way. Anything I wanted to do, I had to try and hammer PHP into the shape I wanted it to be to get my work done. I always felt like I was writing too many lines of code to do something. And even after several rounds of refactoring and code reviews and feedback, it never felt clean. It never felt concise. It always felt like bad code. Whereas with Perl, I could be as concise or as verbose as I wanted to. I could turn the verbosity up to 11 and I could still follow what I was doing. And when I went through and refactored, everything always got cleaner. And it always felt easier to read and easier to maintain. That project took about 2 or 3 months from start to finish. And by the end of it, I was a pretty dedicated Perl developer. Because Perl worked with me. For the first experience I'd had as a programmer, I wasn't working against the language I was using. The language was helping me. I've done a lot of other things with Perl since then. You know, got into unit testing and TDD and object-oriented development and all sorts of other things. But that's been really consistent. The language has always helped me. It's always made me feel like I'm writing something that's effective. I've always been happy with it at the end of the day. And that's really the whole point of the story, is that I did get thrown in the deep end. I had to learn this at speed. There wasn't a lot of time between when I got there and when things had to ship. But Perl helped me swim. Thank you. I think there's time for one or two if anyone has one. Yeah.
I'm very curious.
Yeah. Well, that's about the time I realized that the Perl was the fun stuff. And PHP wasn't fun at all. It is for now, but we're doing a complete rewrite of that, and it's going away. Parts of it are going to be Perl. I mean, we're changing everything on it. We're changing the underlying database. We're changing the whole architecture of the application. Have to migrate the old data if we don't want to, so we can just cut over and keep going. But the nice thing there is we have all the old data. So if we want to, we can repopulate into this with very little difficulty, a few days. Because it's not a migration, it would be a reprocess. Yeah?
What you were saying about the reception that you got in the community versus elsewhere, I also had personal experience with that, again, now 16, 17 years. And in my first year of programming and programming Perl, and the first lightning talk I ever gave at a YAPC was Montreal in 2001, and it was called like how many Perl did, and the Perl with 32 users, and other things, and basically demonstrated that this portion of the Perl community was more similar to that elsewhere. So your observation is empirical based.
I'm glad to know it. That would be interesting. I have to say that I think Stack Overflow has actually done a really good job of regularizing that across different languages. The level of courtesy there is much higher than you see on some language-specific fora. Yeah. Yep. Oh, sure. I didn't have anything to project anyway. All I had was a title spine.